Hello and welcome, Emily, Laura, Ubaldo, and Jesse, to my feedback to your group on your Google Hangout 1. I just wanted to tell you that I was glad that Jesse was able to set it up for you, and Emily, thank you for facilitating the group discussion. It was very well run, and I really like how you introduced the questions and sort of bridged and linked throughout the discussion, and the camera was on the right people and all that. So thank you for following the format and running it as a team effort. And I know that you did not go in order on the questions, so I'm just going to highlight some of the comments that I had for regarding your discussion. So you started with the false positives and the issues that related to domestic versus intelligence collected in a foreign context. And you had a really good discussion around those topics. I think at some point you mentioned that in Adal's video, there was this issue of traditionally we did not focus, or it wasn't commonly accepted to focus on domestic intelligence gathering. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that it wasn't just the rule that sort of run the structure of intelligence community. It was more grounded in the Constitution and specifically in the Fourth Amendment. So there are legal constitutional constraints that certainly do not apply in an international context, because as the CIA, not being a law enforcement agency, obviously operates in foreign contexts, those issues of constitutional rights do not apply to foreign citizens. And certainly the same is the case for limited foreign counterintelligence activities of FBI as a law enforcement agency. When FBI did have the intelligence mission post 1947, that mission focused on foreign individuals residing or operating in the United States. So the fundamental difference is that FBI did have that intelligence gathering mission, but it was on foreign nationals within the US. And CIA, of course, was not bound by those constitutional constraints. So within that prism, we have those discussions about the difference between false positives that we can tolerate in those international concepts, because the repercussions of civil liberties are not as grand as certainly in our domestic policy. And, I want to sort of insert a discussion to that on the domestic intelligence nexus in other countries and a little bit of a history of domestic spying. And I don't know if you recall, but the modern terrorism certainly came out, and the notion of modern terrorism from the French Revolution at the end of the 1700s. And if you recall, the French Revolution abolished the monarchy, the king and the queen, and off went their heads, and establish a new political order in France in the midst of other monarchies in Europe at the time, where there was a new political system that did not have any policy or organizational structure foundations. And as such, the new French Republic was extremely vulnerable and needed to be safeguarded. So during that time, the leaders of French Revolution, and there were two critical figures at that time, there was Danton and Maximilien Robespierre. established the Committee of Public Safety. And the Committee of Public Safety, we can say, was the MI5 of the French Revolution at a time. And the job of the Committee of Public Safety was to make sure that to protect the new republic that was grounded in ideas of equality, liberty, and fraternity, that this republic was not threatened because it was very precarious. So the people that were involved with the Committee of Public Safety, MI5 of the French Revolution, so to speak, their job was to eavesdrop in bars, taverns, associations, different intellectual groups, and specifically within the fractions of different supporters of the revolution, to make sure that the ideas that were being expressed by them were not a threat to, so to speak, national security or the security of that new emerging republic that was very threatened because all the countries around it, around France, still had monarchies. And certainly when the revolution happened, not everybody was very happy with it, particularly the peasants in France, that their fate was pretty much very similar during the revolution as it was under the king. And so they were not particularly supportive because their lives have not changed very much. And there was a lot of pressure back to, for them, they were not agreeing with those new structures. So based on dissident voices that were threatening, the Committee of Public Safety introduced what was called as law of the suspect. And the law of the suspect said that, if anybody is caught talking bad about the Republic, that was a threat to the existence of France at a time. And those were public enemies, and they were to be executed. And of course, the executions happened by the guillotine, and the processes, the trials were one-day trials. And in the process, we had what was called a reign of terror. And this is where the term terrorism comes from. The term terrorism comes to us from the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror and the first state-imposed terror activities. And those are very directly linked to domestic intelligence services or operations. And from that, one can extrapolate to different security services, internal security services under other political arrangements, notably in Soviet Russia, by the activities on NKVD, which later became a KGB, also by the activities of the secret police in East Germany called Stasi, as well as activities of such internal security apparatus like Savak in Iran before the revolution during the times of the Shah. And so all those examples of domestic spying or the internal domestic intelligence gathering have been historically marred by abuse of power, infringement on civil liberties, and prosecutions under laws that were in the name of national security or safeguarding some type of political system. Therefore, the United States, with very limited history of intelligence coming out of World War II, was reluctant and not willing to establish those type of structures in the United States. So I think that historical backdrop is important for us to keep in mind, that the intentions for the Committee of Public Safety in France were grounded in very idealistic ideas of liberty and freedom and fraternity. And one should always remember that part of the history. because Robespierre, Maximilien Robespierre, who was the main architect of the French Revolution, was the idealist. And eventually him and Danton were also in the final days of the Reign of Terror executed. So sort of keep that in mind. Naturally, I'm talking about France, but even in Russia in the 14th century, in the times of Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar, he established really the first known structure of repression through the system of oprichniks. The Tsar had the nobility that was his advising body, and because he was quite dysfunctional, that nobility started revolting against him. So he established this group of criminals, the people that were pulled out of dungeons, that were reporting on his nobles to let him know who was against him. And he instituted a state of terror in his, so to speak, Senate or advising body as well. So those examples, historical examples, are typically marked by high degree of corruption and abuse of power as far as internal domestic intelligence entities are concerned from the historical background. So you had some good discussions on of course, I think Emily was talking about overwhelming false positives, or increased number of cases can cause numbness among the intelligence community, and inability to discern, what the actually actionable intelligence might be. Ubalda was discussing technology and, the changing landscape of domestic threats, and Jesse sort of connected that to Pearl Harbor and post-war era that dictated a little bit different approaches to intelligence. It was external. It was, the threat was the nuclear threat from the nation state. As Treverton discussed, the target has changed significantly since the Cold War. And so has the focus on, what truly that domestic intelligence and foreign intelligence governing activities, where those lines start getting blurry. So you also had a discussion on the increased focus on technology. I think Laura was discussing that, in a Cold War era, it was human or the collection discipline that relies on human sources that was driving the intelligence collection. It was a discipline that was the most successful, and it made sense in that operational environment because we could train people linguistically and politically. We were able to assess a whole country with its organizational structures, with its political system, and if they were savvy in that, they knew what to look for. Whereas now, the focus is on operating actors that are in a dark web and that get into very interconnected networks of technology and so on and so forth. So human is not a prevalent mode, or is not maybe as successful in as far as a collection discipline. And something I have to add to that is that human intelligence is very time consuming. The assets and the networks and the environments where you can put those operators develop over time. And that was possible during a sort of status quo during the Cold War era. But the changes are happening so rapidly with information growth and technology growth today that maintaining, nourishing, monitoring and managing human operators is becoming increasingly very complex, and also it might be not the most effective method, particularly when we talk about the foreign intelligence. So with the question about the trade-off between security and civil liberties, certainly you have, we are in a paradigm where, we are looking at who determines the threats to and how those threats are defined at the policy level. And where that line gets pushed about how much of civil liberties we are willing to surrender in the name of domestic security. And I think it's really important when we talk about it is that, and I think Emily was making really good points about that once you moved that line a little bit further, then, it gets pushed and pushed. And of course, people are willing to surrender some civil liberties, particularly in the aftermath of big critical events. And then over time, the issues of privacy are becoming more prevalent, and as the complacency sits in, because we are hopefully preventing or deterring some type of activities, people are less willing to abdicate some of those liberties. I will tell you from personal perspective that you can have an argument, and you have voiced that argument, that if you don't have anything to worry about, then certainly you should be willing to allow the government to have access to certain information, because you don't have to really worry about it unless you are involved in criminal activity. But then you discussed the big data hunt and collection, cast net, big net being cast over records that we don't ultimately know how they're going to be used. And I am very particular about my way of thinking about expectation of privacy, because I have lived through the martial law in Poland. And if you know about the geopolitical situation of Poland in 1980s, there was a big shift in public ability to tolerate the political system at a time, and there was a big threat of a general strike, which is a threat to national security. And obviously, a big concern for the government and policymakers was that if Poland goes on strike and people go out in the streets, then Russia is going to invade Poland and there's going to be a bloody revolution. Therefore, the martial law was imposed. And you would think that, in the name of security, you've got nothing to worry about. You shouldn't really worry about the fact that the government imposes a martial law to prevent people from speaking freely. But in a day of the martial law, my residence and my grandmother residence and my aunt residence all simultaneously were accessed by the military and supported by the local police. And they were pretty much ransacking residences looking for anything. Knowing very well that my family was on the opposite spectrum of political affiliations, so we were not associated with the only party that was in Poland at the time, which was a Communist Party. There was not a particular suspicion of any wrongdoing, and yet there was this, white net being cast preemptively on looking for anything that could show diversionary activities by those families. And that, on me, being a teenager, left a tremendous impact on how I perceive civil liberties. And, this actually pretty much, traced or delineated the course of my life, because I knew from that very moment that I'll never live in a country that allows that process, where somebody can enter your home without a warrant, without a probable cause, and preemptively look for something that could be not agreeing with the current political status quo. This is, very much going back to French Revolution, the law of the suspect. You were suspect of not agreeing with political agenda, even though you were not doing anything. There was this really strong violation of civil liberties. So you had some type of discussion here on who sets those requirements, who decides what the threats to national security are, and who creates that discourse. And at some point, I don't remember where it was in your discussion, Laura mentioned that, when you define terrorism, obviously defining a threat of terrorism as being high gives you permission to cast those large nets for data collection. And yet we tend to not be very discriminate in what we consider terrorism. And I think Ubaldo was mentioning active shooters and, all those events of mass violence. And you had a discussion on, are those events of mass violence truly the terrorism events in a political sense? Jesse was talking about, that there's got to be that political aim of coercing civilian population and so on and so forth, which certainly active shooters for most part do not have that element. So even though I think Laura mentioned that they aim to terrorize, they are not necessarily terrorist activities, yet you see the larger discourse develops often, pushes the envelope and increase hypervigilance about those events. And then, that hypervigilance creates policies that require a higher degree of constraint on civil liberty. So that's another issue with that. You also talked about the social contract, and from Trevor Ton discussion on the issues of public trust, and how do you gauge the pound of intelligence and the value it has if we are operating in an environment where we learn about those intelligence processes through the failures or through leaks. So while the processes are not very transparent and public doesn't have really good knowledge base to make sound judgments on the value of intelligence, it's shrouded in a veil of mystery. And when it is shrouded in a veil of mystery and those leaks happen, then that social contract is broken and the trust is broken. And, then people will go on a defensive on, how much of the liberties they are willing to surrender. So, of course, there's this whole controversy also, and you discussed that about whistleblowers, patriots, or other traitors. And that is also something to consider, how much do we value those civil liberties? And also, I think it's important to keep in mind that just like in my case, you might not know how important civil liberties are to you unless they have been violated specifically for you, if you have been the one that was wrongfully accused or the one against whom a false positive was triggered, and you have, every time you go and travel now, you are on all those watch lists that are ineffective. And so until it happens to us individually, we are willing to surrender the privacy of others. And that's, that's why some people will have a different perception on, viewing leaks as being deleterious to national security versus being truly a step to curtail abuses of government to infringe upon our constitutional rights. And that's an inherent problem of domestic intelligence is, we're not that particularly concerned of the rights of Pakistanis when we target and have collateral damage right through drone strikes and things like that. It's when you have intelligence activities on mosques in other countries, obviously you don't have the issue of a freedom of religion as you have in the United States. So those constitutional constraints play a big role. And so the question is now, are we in times where Constitution, perhaps in its current form, does not respond to security needs of a modern society or the United States, and that's a larger question. Very good discussion on when you talked about secrecy. Again, going back to human intelligence. I think Laura mentioned that so much of the information, open source information, is available, that the value of secrecy maybe is not as prevalent as it was during the Cold War. It's actually the ability to sift and being able to discern among the stuff that's already out there that becomes a critical priority. So as a collection discipline, to what degree do we value open source intelligence and how we tap into that? And certainly this is a discussion that relates to criminal intelligence. And criminal intelligence is a little bit different than what we consider the secret trade craft, because criminal intelligence certainly is anchored in more solid evidence. It's following the leads, not necessarily thinking out what things might be, which is more of the intelligence as a prediction, more so than it is, identifying the components of, the puzzle pieces that are there. But certainly when you talked about domestic intelligence, it is the local law enforcement that is more in tune with the local community, and they're able to collect or assess the situation better than the members of the IC community that are at some departmental levels in Washington, D.C., and who actually do not discern among, those local jurisdictions and different communities and community members. But does that make intelligence at the local level different, and intelligence processes different? And this is going to be an ongoing topic of discussion for us this semester. What is Homeland Security intelligence, and is it different than national security intelligence? And do you expect local law enforcement to get involved in intelligence-led policing, or are they actually supposed to do more than that? Are they bound by those preemptive, so to speak, actions? And if so, how is that possible within the current legal system? So I thought that with that, you had a really good discussion on profiling and the expectation of privacy. Again, you linked to law enforcement activities at the local level. There is a discussion, some of the discussion you had was on big data and the small granular things that fall through the cracks. And again, I think that what brought your discussion to the local level, community and social level, where you get that detail, where the local law enforcement and security element at the local level is a lot more linked to those little things, a lot more so that either the military component of intelligence gathering or that other members of the IC community like NSA. And again, you raised the issue of distinguishing the mass of information that's available and how to distinguish the noise from the relevant information. And I think that you had some discussion here on shooting in Florida. You linked that to the ability of policymakers to actually the issue maybe not being of big data, but small intelligence pieces at the local level, and the ability of policymakers to hear what is happening, what the local community has to say, and certainly that's a big challenge. You had in this week's discussions, you were exposed to Sherman Kent on intelligence, and some of his arguments were that the policymaker doesn't only have to hear, but they have to believe and they have to ultimately act. And so you can have a good intelligence process, but you don't have policymakers that are actually acting on intelligence. And I think that was your discussion about the warning signs and information coming into the FBI office on a desk, but it was regionalized. So, those messages did not get actionable decision-making in the Florida case. When you discussed the strategic intelligence being available in 2001 and different elements of the intelligence community being privy to being aware of red flags, you talked about different agencies with different missions, with historical animosity, different organizational culture, and so all involved in competitive analysis, which was predominating at the time in 2001. So even though strategically, the 9/11 shouldn't have been a surprise. Our intelligence processes were not synced. And again, you had competing missions, different collection disciplines, competitive intelligence versus what we're going to later on called fused intelligence. And I really loved that part of discussion. I think Laura talked about those turf wars between certainly organizational culture has affected the intelligence process. You can still see it today as you look at what's happening in the whole intelligence discussion today. The FBI and CIA, the two huge personalities, William Donovan and Edgar Hoover, and how that historical legacy persisted into early 2000s. So, and that's just one case of those two different agencies that were considered themselves in their different rights very elitistic. One, a premier law enforcement agency, the other one, premier intelligence agency, and having little regard historically for one another and viewing their missions as very separate. And so that's why I asked you about the difference between FBI and CIA. Waldo had some really good distinguishing factors. One, very clearly a law enforcement agency under the Department of Justice. The other one, clearly the intelligence component with totally different oversight and different mission operating outside of the bounds of constitutional constraints. Certainly, no law enforcement authority by the FBI, and that's, that affected the events pre 9/11, is that, what we've been talking ever since about the different classification systems as well, different who needs to know what, and there was very little integration across the intelligence community. It didn't help, obviously, that CIA could not predict the fall of the Soviet Union, which was one of the biggest CIA failures. Clearly, all the signs should have been there that the Soviet Union was on the brink of dissolution and the end of the Cold War. Sort of caught CIA by surprise. There were even attempts to totally disband CIA. So, very, very interesting dynamics of the intelligence community coming out of the Cold War, with CIA being in a very precarious position itself. Lost a lot of its institutional capability with respect to the number of analysts that they had to let go, and so on. So there are other factors there as well. Ubaldo made a point that, of course, pre 9/11, domestic intelligence gathering, the way we understand it, clandestine, not based on your typical criminal intelligence process, were not there because of the Patriot Act. Something to make clear is what Patriot Act allowed. Patriot Act allowed for the FBI that assumed more of a domestic intelligence agency role. So not foreign counterintelligence, but the domestic intelligence post 9/11, because it was already situated in some of that intelligence collection activity within the US. But what Patriot Act allowed FBI to do is to set preliminary investigations without probable cause, but with reasonable suspicion on U.S. individuals. So that is a huge departure from FISC and Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act from the 70s. Which allowed those national security letters to be issued on different individuals if they were very strongly involved with a foreign element, or if they were foreign element themselves. So that is sort of a change in dynamics with the Patriot Act. So you could set up the preliminary investigation for 30 days with less of a burden of evidence on the U.S. citizen. And that sort of launched us into this era of increased domestic intelligence process, conceived as clandestine and, with less constitutional constraints, so to speak. When you're talking about the warnings in the intelligence community pre 9/11, in addition to organizational competitiveness, animosity, different organizational cultures, I think it was Laura who mentioned the arrogance and too big to fail, and also looking at the aspect of terrorism from the far enemy versus near enemy. And certainly if one was to follow the events post Cold War, when the Cold War ended, there were indications, analytically speaking, that the threat was becoming a far enemy threat, that, particularly with respect to violent jihadi religious terrorism, there was a shift from operating within the proximity. So I think you mentioned Syria and Israel, Saudi Arabia and Israel, and bringing the fight to the far enemy and in all the proclamations by Osama bin Laden, and more and more discourse in the operatives of Al-Qaeda, it was evident that their role of perpetuating violence changed geographically from the what they call near enemy, so that would be Israel, for example, to far enemy, to bring it in the United States. But we were not following those. One of the intelligence strategists, called it the 2 decades of apathy, and perhaps arrogance as well. Lack of imagination, certainly. So you talked about, again, I'm sort of jumping around, but I think your discussion did as well. So you talked again about being careful about who sets, the levels of threats and determines, what is the actual threat, because, events like that, of course, cause overreaction. And who calls it, who determines that something is viewed not as criminal act, but as a terrorist act. I think this is the open discussion as well. A lot of times it happens at the local level. A lot of times it will happen because, the first entity at the local level called it as such. And that makes me think about the Chris Dorner case from California. If you recall, he was somebody who was let go of LAPD and got on a shooting rampage, and eventually got killed, but killed some law enforcement officers. And from the very first moments of his activity, he had a manifesto, so had some of those elements of what distinguishes a terrorist from a criminal. Certainly met a lot of those indicators of a terrorist, a manifesto, a political grievance or systemic grievance, and not an opportunist, somebody that does plan it and executes a certain plan. But it was called by the local police department, LA Police Department, called it an act of terrorism. And this is how it became a part of a discourse later on in the through the media. So something to pay attention to is who calls it and based on what. So Laura, I agree with you that labeling is very important. Who writes it, who writes that narrative, what does it mean that we now have a global war on terror, who coined that phrase, and what does it mean? What is a global war on terror, and what does it open as far as overreaction, as far as international arrangements? And if we have a global war on terror, which is in my opinion a horrible acronym, that means that we can operate in some areas where with countries that we're not necessarily at war with, like in Yemen, which is a failing state. And that gives us the authority to use the drone strikes and stuff like that against the population, because we now have the enemy that's defined as, this fragmented enemy, and the state borders don't really influence our decision making. So again, a big issue in how we do activities and engagement, kinetic engagement specifically in foreign territories. And we have historically been a lot less cognizant of those civil liberties when they take us outside of our domestic policy. Something that Ubaldo talked about is a new threat that you've identified as, integrity of democratic processes. And so a changing landscape of threats changes the requirements for intelligence. And again, I'm honing in because in order for us to discuss Homeland Security intelligence, it's really important to bring it to how it's sort of made its way, that intelligence process that we were not really approving of for many, many decades, because historically it showed so abusive, how we allowed it to creep into our spheres of functioning every day in the United States. So with that, you're talking about the integrity of elections, and that's, again, connected to changes in technology and cyber issues and the way we are rethinking those intelligence processes. So that certainly gives us new perspectives, what the vulnerability is, and the actions that we take, and some civil liberties that are enmeshed in that. Again, Laura talked about, the as far as how you measure the success of the intelligence process, and I'm still talking about this clandestine or secret, covert, more of a law enforcement, traditional criminal intelligence, not the way we collect intelligence, on the in a foreign context, but basing our practices on what we're able to access at the community level through, traditional law enforcement work. But if you recall, obviously, when you go back to 1993 World Trade Center bombing, relying on traditional law enforcement, criminal law enforcement intelligence wasn't enough in 1993, and very important signals were missed, and networks and connections that will later, the perpetrators of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing were people that eventually were linked to Al-Qaeda. And this is where, for the very first time, the name of Osama bin Laden comes out as the founder of some of those activities. So we have to acknowledge one thing, that when we talk about intelligence, criminal intelligence collection is totally different than foreign intelligence collection, because of, yes, to some degree we do have undercover operations, but in order to establish an undercover operation in a domestic sense in local law enforcement, it's a little bit different than setting up clandestine operations, intelligence operations overseas by the State Department. So how is the 16-member community different? Again, Jesse went back to that question and talked about relationships. Certainly, we have a very interesting, very decentralized, very fragmented tapestry of local law enforcement. So the question to ask yourself is also, what does it mean local? Who is at all involved, and are those relationships always really good? Because there is, I would argue with so many different agencies, those relationships might have similar problems, competitiveness, egos, jurisdictions, territories that come into play. But certainly those players are closer to the context, the actual context, because, the criminal terrorist event, or whatever the threat might be, happens in the local jurisdiction. It will happen in New York on 9/11, but certainly it can happen in any town, USA. So we're going to discuss intelligence-led policing in a little, and some of the models. The concept comes out of Britain, of course, and so we're going to have a dedicated session to that. I'm not going to dwell on intelligence-led policing. I'm going to talk about the effectiveness of intelligence and how what is a pound of intelligence worth, as Emily cited, Dahl. When you're talking about $70 billion a year enterprise with 5 million employees, and again here you had conversations on fusion centers. And the fusion centers are, of course, the product of all hazards environment that we have been living in since 9/11. The effectiveness of fusion centers, the research on it is non-conclusive. Again, we're going to have a discussion on that, but certainly fusion centers do bring and mesh different entities with different levels of need to know together to build a common operating picture at the local level. Then those fusion centers feed the information up, and it's being analyzed and then disseminated. But the main finding of the fusion centers is that even though their mission is that were created under the terrorist threat, their mission is more supportive of actually domestic incident management, natural disasters, and traditional law enforcement or criminal intelligence. So, of course, the issues with fusion centers are the same as you already mentioned: clearances, the cost of clearances, the benefit to the agency that designates a particular police officer or a particular law enforcement official to a fusion center, and what they can bring back to that agency. It is still a very one-way process, and that has been an issue with fusion centers as well. Some of the other issues you discussed with respect to the differences between FBI and CIA is that FBI operates in the open and not necessarily with CIA. But I have to tell you that foreign counterintelligence, and I know it firsthand, foreign counterintelligence with the Bureau was also a clandestine process. And there is a difference in, particularly in the way of developing your sources. Criminal intelligence and foreign intelligence rely on different human intelligence, whereas criminal intelligence usually comes from confidential informers, so-called CIs. Those confidential informers typically are your usual suspects who are involved in criminal activity. Those are the people that are willing to strike a deal, to get lesser sentences, or they are involved in some type of criminal activity, and their motivations for collaboration are purely opportunistic, generally. And so that is the criminal intelligence, typically where your criminal intelligence comes from. And foreign intelligence comes from assets, and the motivations for that group of individuals for human intelligence are a little bit different. They are typically more political. But if you think about developing assets by, let's say, in foreign contexts, those usually will be individuals who we win their minds and hearts to support our cause. For whatever intrinsic reasons, they want a better life for their family, they want a better system in their country, they want a better process, more democracy. And so their motivation to come forth with a particular information and to feed that information is a little bit different than your typical confidential informer in a criminal justice system. And that becomes important when we start looking at how we have moved sort of to looking at intelligence at a domestic level as being collected from individuals that might give us, they're not in a criminal justice system, and their motivations in a domestic context. And I think this is playing out right now. And I think this is really important, that the sources in a foreign intel traditionally have been different and had different motivations. for criminal intelligence, the sources are different and they have different motivations. When the two bleed over, then there is this issue with, what is a motivation for someone to provide a particular piece of information about somebody else in a domestic context. And I'm taking you back to France and to the revolution and the motivations of people that provided information then. And obviously, in a context like that, motivations can come from a variety of reasons. They can be rivalries. They can be you don't like your neighbor. So in that context of intelligence, where you get it, and for what motivations, collecting intelligence from humans in a domestic context becomes very, very tricky. So this is another difference between, that foreign and domestic is the sources. And I want you to keep it in the back of your mind as far as human intelligence. Finally, your discussion was around the fact whether we should have a separate domestic intelligence agency, the type of MI5, or whether we need to leverage existing structures and redefine their goals, or streamline their processes. This is also an ongoing discussion for the class for this semester. I think Laura was saying that, we do not need to create another agency. We've got 16 members of the IC community, which in itself is already very large and very bureaucratic and very overgrown sort of apparatus. And certainly, I just wanted to bring your attention to the fact that MI5 was not operating in public in Britain, or was not known that structure was existing in the UK until 1980s. So there was, even that fact shows that, there is this, shroud of secrecy about those institutions. But also MI5 did not prevent or protect Londoners from 7/7. So July 7, 2005 attacks, as you read in Loventhal, there were some failures there. So as much as we deplore maybe the lack of our domestic intelligence apparatus, it did not seem to be very effective for the Brits neither. Now, if you look at Shin Bet in Israel, you might develop a different picture of that agency. But a good discussion on, do we need, or is FBI, even as far as its mission and history and luggage, or, burden of years of organizational culture, are they well suited and well positioned to be a domestic intelligence agency, particularly for that human intelligence? So I think Emily was talking about the fact that if it was to be established, I think one of you said that if it was to be established, maybe a good time would have been post 9/11 or immediately post 9/11, and we got a little bit too far with another participant in that entire panoply of intelligence agencies. Now we have the Department of Homeland Security with its arm being in that intelligence community. And so it's probably much harder to justify going back on the 17 years of trying to create different homeland security intelligence structures and now totally, revise everything from the scratch. I thought that was a very insightful comment that you made. Jesse had some discussion on too much policy, and I'm not really sure what you meant by that. And I'm not really certain where it fit in a discussion, but you definitely said that we had too many policies related to domestic intelligence. So I wasn't sure. I can't comment on that because I wasn't really clear. Overall, I wanted to say that you covered the topics. You had interesting discussions. I see that you are covering the readings and the videos, so I'm looking forward to subsequent discussions. We have 3 more left on those Google Hangouts throughout the semester, and certainly some of those concepts we have discussed. And with policy, Jesse, when we talk about policy and policy makers, I think the important thing for us to focus on is going to be within the intelligence cycle. And which number 1 of the intelligence cycle, as you read last week, is the requirements and setting the requirements, and that boundary between the policymaker and the intelligence community, particularly as it has to do with the analytical component, with the analyst, with somebody that provides the intelligence product to the policymaker. And I think it's very important that if you do not, it's kind of like research. And I think that's why I have a question for you about your capstones for this week's discussions. But it's sort of like research, intelligence process, that if you do not have the right requirement, just like you don't have the right research question, then your entire research is going to be useless, or is going to miss the mark, or is going to be irrelevant, or is not going to target the issue that you need to target, because it all starts with the question, what do you need to know and why? Why do you need to do this research? What is the purpose, and what is the significance, and what exactly are you going to look at? And so the requirements in the intelligence cycle process are really critical. And who sets those, how they set it, and what is this big divide between policymakers and the intelligence community? That's certainly another topic of discussion. So I wanted to thank you for contributing to this Google Hangout, and I enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to the next one.